Welcome, everyone, to the PFF Fantasy Podcast IDP edition. I'm John Macri, and with rookie season wrapped, it's time to move to the Dynasty rankings portion of the offseason before we fully dive into the 2025 redraft content. And what better way to kick that off than by talking some linebackers? I'll be running through my top 24 Dynasty linebackers today, breaking down kind of my thoughts and rationale, and hopefully helping you guys sort them for either your dynasty startup drafts or, just how to value the guys that you might already have on your roster. So plenty to get into here. So let's get it. All right, whether you're playing in a tackle heavy league, true position, or even big play scoring, one thing's for sure, linebackers, they don't always have to be the most important position, but they are often the most popular position. And the reason being tackles, right? Tackles are king in IDP and just much more common than sacks, right? So while sacks for our edge defenders can be the key to helping us win our weeks or our leagues, it's the tackles that keep us in the fight every week. And there are no greater contributors to that stat than the linebackers. Now, I will say before I even get into the rankings, dynasty linebacker rankings and redraft linebacker rankings are very different, at least for me, anyways, because for redraft, we just want guys who will be playing full-time roles. It doesn't matter their age or their PFF grades. Just being a 100% snap player is going to lead to production, and we don't need to get too picky when that's the case. So for Dynasty, we can get pickier, even though there's still plenty of value in grabbing those one-year wonder types when it comes to, having to rank these guys long-term, though. We're looking for full-time potential, team investment in that player. Basically, that could be represented by contract or draft capital. And then age obviously can play a factor as well, right? Though it's not overly important since we get plenty of linebackers that still start as 100% players into their 30s, and they're more effective than, say, like 30 something wide receivers or running backs, right? So we don't have to be as picky there. And that's the key, really just kind of finding the players who we think can and will be starters in the league for ideally the next 3 seasons. That's about as far out as we should try and project this position because there is a ton of turnover at linebacker. So with all that being said, we'll get right into the top 24 dynasty linebackers starting at LB 24, and then we'll work our way to LB 1. And LB 24 for me is Junior Coulson of the Los Angeles Chargers. So right away, I know a player who has yet to produce for us in IDP, but keeping in mind that most rookie linebackers are not going to make an impact in year one. And Coulson, who also dealt with missed time, was no different. I would expect Coulson to play a much bigger role this season, considering not just that the team spent a third round pick on him, but his familiarity with Jim Harbaugh and Jesse Minter out of Michigan should start paying dividends here, as the team didn't really add any help to the linebacker room, along with Diane Henley. So Henley, by the way, also a former third round pick who played even fewer snaps in his rookie year before emerging as a high end IDP starter for us in year two. So again, teams aren't going to rely on their rookies often, if they can afford to be patient with them. But considering the day two investment in Coulson in 2024, I would expect him to be a likely starter this season, even if not in a full-time capacity right away. Like the expectation is that he's a much bigger part of the defense and relevant for IDP. So 22 years old, former day two pick. You don't need much more than that to be valued highly in Dynasty for the linebacker position, considering it's generally a pretty gross landscape when it comes to long-term value. Okay, LB 23 for me is a player who I had in this similar range last year, and people didn't love the spot because he hadn't done too much for IDP up until that point, but he definitely delivered last year, and that's Nakobe Dean of the Philadelphia Eagles. So Dean took over as a starter in year 3 of his NFL career, also a former third rounder, by the way. And if not for injury at the end of the year and the concern that maybe he won't be healthy to start this year, he'd probably probably be a lot higher on this list considering how good he looked in his first year as a starter. Now, I will say, Dean was at the Eagles OTAs this week. He was wearing a practice jersey. He didn't have a knee brace or anything either. So he didn't practice, but I'd say that's a pretty encouraging indication that he might be ready for week one. And maybe he should be higher on this list if we're being honest. So we'll keep an eye out there because there was at least a chance that he wouldn't play much at all this season. But that recent news out of camp is a little bit more encouraging than that. So back to what he did last year, he not only finished as a top 10 IDP linebacker, but he earned top 20 marks in PFF grades, both in overall and run defense. He also finished 92nd percentile in tackles versus expected, proving to be one of the more efficient tacklers of the season, and still relatively young for the position as well, just 24 years old. So there might be a wasted year in 2025. We'll see what the injury looks like, but I think we should expect him back in the mix beyond this season or as, at some point this season as well, right? Because again, it's looking like he might be healthier than expected. Now, Jihad Campbell also affects this ranking just a bit because as much as it sounds like the team wants Campbell to play a little on the edge or at the very least in a hybrid edge slash off ball role, there's the risk that he plays so well at off-ball linebacker that he takes that job and never looks back, right? And with Zack Bond too locked up for the next 3 years, it's possible that there's not a long-term future for Nakobe Dean in Philadelphia. It's possible he signs elsewhere in 2026 when he's a free agent. So there's enough question marks there to keep him, I think, inside the 2020 or inside the top 24, just outside the top 20 for me for now. We'll see how things shake out here as the offseason goes on, and then obviously into the season as well. All right, LB22 for me is Blake Cashman of the Minnesota Vikings, coming off his second straight year of really just being an above average IDP starter. I mean, with Cashman, there was at least a chance that his 2023 season with the Texans was going to be kind of this one off and never really repeated again. But then Brian Flores and company identified him as kind of the quarterback of their defense. They signed him to a nice 3-year deal last offseason, and he delivered another great season. He even ranked as the LB4 in points per game in 2024. Now, Cashman, he's definitely missed quite a bit of time in his NFL career with injury, though it hasn't been too bad since he's been an actual full-time starter. And he's also under contract, not just for this coming season, but next year as well. So Cashman should continue to be in a great position to remain kind of a locked in IDP starter for the next couple of seasons. And as much as I would love that to be Ivan Pace, that's just not how they want to run things in Minnesota right now. They very clearly prefer the Cashman as LB1, and we should too. LB21 for me is Patrick Queen, now of the Pittsburgh Steelers, formerly of the Baltimore Ravens, but most importantly, he's a former first round pick. So the NFL is going to squeeze that bias dry for as long as he's in the league. And that's definitely important here with a lot of these defensive players in Dynasty getting first round capital. It's like a free pass to push for a starting role for the first like 10 years of your career, no matter how much you suck, as long as you're not a complete piece of shit, basically. And Queen is proving that to be the case, like getting a nice contract in free agency, starting in Pittsburgh last year, didn't play very well, and he's still set to start again in 2025. Now, as I talked about a ton last offseason as far as how to value Queen for redraft specifically, which not everyone wanted to believe, you know who you are. He should be valued closer to like LB24 than the top 12 at his position, where everyone kind of seemed to want him to be. He's one of the league's most inefficient tacklers at the position, leaves a ton of meat on the bone every single year. He finished as LB20 on nearly 1,100 snaps. That's top 5 snaps in the league, by the way. So for a position that we keep saying snaps are the most important for production, he should have been much better than LB20 and LB36 in points per game. But because of his lack of tackling ability, he's just not the player that we all want him to be, I think. And he's finished in the bottom 15th percentile at his position in tackles versus expected in each of the past 4 years. Basically, he sucks at tackling. I don't know how else to say it. But look, he found his way to first round capital, and the NFL continues to value that, years later, as if to say that they can get the potential out of these types of players. So Queen will still get starting chances for a few more years, and that alone carries top 24 dynasty linebacker value. All right, the first rookie on the show today is my LB20, and that's Demetrius Knight Jr. of the Cincinnati Bengals, a second round pick in this year's draft, which, if you haven't been paying attention, that is great capital for a linebacker. Now, as the Bengals depth chart stands right now, Knight is not in a position to do much for us in year one, but there's a more than likely chance that Jermaine Pratt will be traded or released this offseason. He appears to be unhappy in Cincinnati at the moment. Now, it's entirely possible that they restructure Pratt's contract and things work out for 2025, and he's still, a starter there for this year. But I think based on what the Bengals did by spending 2 draft picks on linebackers in the 2025 draft, selecting Knight in the second and then Barrett Carter in the fourth, that the writing is kind of on the wall that Pratt is not destined to be on the team much longer. So with that being the case, Knight, as a second rounder, is in a great spot to step in as a starter, potentially as soon as year one, and make an IDP impact. So the Bengals have been rolling out 2 full-time starters these past couple of years, but keep in mind, Lou Anarumo is out as defensive coordinator. Al Golden out of Notre Dame comes in, and we might not get 2 full-time starters here in 2025, at least, with Logan Wilson being the lone full-time guy. I wouldn't be surprised if they get to a point where Knight is the starter, but he isn't a full-time player right away, if that makes sense. But just getting that starting job that quickly, again, will depend on what happens with Pratt. That's still enough to boost his IDP value. And I think after a promising linebacker prospect score based on his college data, I have hope that Knight will reinforce this kind of LB20 dynasty potential by the end of the season. All right, next up, Kaden Ellis of the Atlanta Falcons, who put together a monster season in 2024, finished as the LB2, delivered 145 tackles and 5 sacks. Ellis, I mean, he was an excellent tackler in 2024, which wasn't the case in previous seasons. He finished 97th percentile at the position in 2024 in tackles versus expected. So, credit to Jimmy Lake, too, coming in as the defensive coordinator last year and getting the most out of Ellis. Now, Lake is out. Jeff Ulbrich is in as the defensive coordinator. So it'll be interesting to see the deployment with Ellis this year in a different defensive system. Plus, they added Jalen Walker, another kind of hybrid edge / off-ball linebacker. So things could be very different this season for Ellis, but it's hard to ignore what he's been able to accomplish as recently as this season and still in a position to be a starter in 2025. I don't necessarily love Ellis here. And if things, do change drastically this year, I could see him falling down the ranks. But at the same time, I think there's still a good chance that we get more of the same from Ellis from what we got last year. And what we got last year was elite. So he's just inside the top 20 dynasty linebackers for me right now. All right, the second Bengals linebacker on the list and LB18 in dynasty for me is Logan Wilson. Now, Wilson has been a perennial starter for the past few seasons, albeit he's dealt with injuries quite a bit, so that's always frustrating. Also not the most efficient tackler, but being a locked-in starter for multiple seasons is key for dynasty rankings, at least my rankings, because if we're going to invest in these guys for long-term, quote unquote, especially, essentially 2 to 3 years, then I need to have faith that they'll be starters and don't have questions about where they'll be next year or if they'll be replaced within their own team. And I don't really have those concerns with Wilson. He's signed through the 2027 season, and I'm sure there's an out in there somewhere. But bottom line is the Bengals have actually invested in this guy, and he's been a good NFL linebacker, even a top 5 graded linebacker in run defense last season. He was LB21 in points per game. And that's just kind of what he is. He's a solid IDP and NFL starter, not sexy, but reliable. And that's a perfectly good way of approaching the position in dynasty and redraft it if it means, we can invest in some other more valuable players at other positions as well. And that's kind of the theme of the next couple players in the ranks here as well, because LB17 for me is Bobby Okereke of the New York Giants, almost identical to Logan Wilson in that he missed time in 2024, has been an inefficient tackler for these past couple of years. He's a solid NFL starter, and he's signed through the next couple of seasons as well as the clear top starter on his team at the position. So these are the kind of guys that we should be looking at if we don't want to invest highly in like the Roquan Smiths or Fred Warners of the world. Spoilers for later, I guess, but there are these types who we can have faith in for more than one season, and that's the case with Bobby O. Um, the only other options in New York right now are Micah McFadden, who more of a part-time option, and then a bunch of destined backups like Darius Moasow, Chris Board, Demetrius Flanagan Fowles. So there's no real concern about him losing his job to anyone right now, and that'll continue to be unlikely as he heads into the final year of his contract as well. So as a full-time starter, there's value there if Bobby Okereke hits free agency as well, because other NFL teams will be looking for experienced and reliable starters. So I wouldn't be surprised to see him continue as a full-time player, even if he leaves the Giants at the end of at the end of his contract, which is more than I could say about really anyone else outside of the top 20 dynasty linebackers. Okay, up at next at LB 16 is Nick Bolton of the Kansas City Chiefs, fresh off a new contract that will keep him with the team through the 2027 season. Now, like Logan Wilson and Bobby O, Bolton hasn't quite been able to deliver like the elite efficiency that he's been drafted for based on his 2021 and 2022 seasons, where he was this incredibly efficient tackler and elite IDP. That being said, he's just 25 years old and really kind of represents, I think, the first shift in the dynasty rankings towards some of the younger players who we should see work as full-time starters for the next few seasons. And that's the case with Bolton. Like if he ever got back to that 2021 and 2022 form, he'd be much higher on this list, but I don't think that should be the necessarily be the expectation with him right now based on his most recent sample set where he finished 23rd percentile in tackles versus expected last year. Still finished as LB 17 on the year. And that's kind of the range for him in both like redraft and dynasty for me relative to the other options at the position. Next up, the first of two free agent linebackers who really got paid to stay on his new team this past season and increased his dynasty value. That's Seattle Seahawks linebacker Ernest Jones, who bounced around quite a bit in 2024. He started the offseason with the Rams, then got traded to Tennessee, then traded again to Seattle, who, despite, being a pending free agent, Seattle decided that they were going to re-sign him and keep him there on a 3-year deal worth $9.5 million APY, by the way. This was massive for Ernest because he could have just as easily ended up on his fourth team in less than a year without a guarantee for a starting role. But instead, Mike McDonald and the Seahawks, they liked him enough to lock him up and keep him as the LB1 in that defense, which is huge for his IDP potential going forward. Because he should, and I say should because who the hell knows for sure what's going to happen, especially with Ernest, but he should stay in that role for at least a couple more seasons and definitely be, and that's definitely encouraging enough, I'd say, to invest in him as kind of this LB 15 for Dynasty right now. All right, LB 14 for me is going to be Quay Walker of the Green Bay Packers. Now, I will say the majority of my dynasty linebacker ranking rationale really wants to push Quaker higher on this list, especially because he's a former first round pick and still just 25 years old. So there's a lot of runway still for Walker to become like a top tier dynasty asset, but he's not there yet, despite getting the opportunity to prove it for a few seasons. Now, um, Walker, he has dealt with injuries last year, especially, and he's missed some time. So that didn't help, but just LB 29 in points per game, which is, it's fine. 64th percentile in tackles versus expected, also fine. Really poor in coverage, 48.8 coverage grade. So even worse than his 2023 season, which was also poor. Now, this is mostly negative stuff, I know, probably not expected for what, describing the LB 14 at this point in the rankings. But again, the linebacker landscape is pretty gross, but he is one that I find I continue to move down because I'm not quite as optimistic that he can be that perennial LB1 option, even if he's a fine bet to be a weekly starter at the position. And again, that round one draft capital will help his cause if he were to leave the Packers at the end of his rookie contract. For me right now, based on his production, he's kind of like the new version of Tremaine Edmonds, another former first round pick who does just enough to remain relevant for us in IDP and in the NFL, but isn't necessarily someone who is worthy of being valued as an LB1 right now. And there's nothing wrong with being new Tremaine Edmonds either. Edmonds continues to be a starter in the NFL, relevant enough for IDP. And I think that's about what I expect for Quay Walker at this point as well, with a lot more optimism about a different Green Bay linebacker that we'll cover in a bit. All right, one more before we get into the top 12. I'm putting TJ Edwards in this LB13 spot because even though he's not like the young slash high draft capital linebacker that a lot of these other guys in this range are, he's still a top IDP option and should be for a few more years. So what's interesting about Edwards is that 2024 was undoubtedly a down year for him in terms of production. He only finished with 127 tackles, his lowest mark since 2021. He finished 10th percentile in tackles versus expected, which is definitely the lowest of his career since I started collecting this data anyways. And he still finished the year as LB14 because he finds a way to produce whenever he's on the field. And he's been one of the more reliable IDP linebackers for a few seasons now. And he also just signed a 2-year contract extension, keeping him as that top linebacker in Chicago through 2027. So he's 28 years old, sure. But again, he's a locked in starter who can absolutely deliver high end IDP production for the position. And there's no question about him doing that for a few more seasons. So, yes, 2024 was a down year, but we'll get another defensive coordinator change in Chicago this year with Dennis Allen coming in because it didn't work in that defense last year. So, I'm banking on a bounce back for TJ Edwards in Chicago, specifically in terms of his tackle efficiency, which should keep him in that high end IDP territory. Okay, top 12 time. And the first linebacker in the top 12 is Terrell Bernard of the Buffalo Bills. Now, Bernard's 2024 season was undeniably not as good as his 2023 season, but it was still clearly good enough for the Bills to give him a 4-year contract extension, which is significant for his dynasty value and definitely puts him in this deserving range of being a top 12 linebacker. Matt Milano restructured his contract recently as well. It doesn't feel like he's going to be on the team much longer beyond this season, as he'll likely be a free agent, Milano, that is. So Bernard appears kind of locked in as the future of that Bills linebacker core. They obviously like him enough to give him that contract, which should influence how we value him in Dynasty as well. He was only LB24 in points per game last year. The coverage grade was abysmal, but those are two areas we could definitely see improve as soon as this season, right? He was 80th percentile among linebackers in tackles versus expected. So, second season in a row where he's outperformed his expected total. He was 89th percentile in 2023. He missed some games last year, which never helps, but I think there's more potential for Bernard to bounce back closer to his 2023 form this season, which might even have him as deserving to be higher on this list. But I think based on what we saw last year and how some of the other younger options also emerged this past year, I'm kind of having him. I'm fine having him as like the LB12 in my top 12 right now. All right. LB11 for me is Diane Henley of the Los Angeles Chargers, who stood his ground as the team's LB1 despite the junior Coulson selection by the Michigan coaching staff. Henley locked in, and he was the lone full-time linebacker for the Chargers for most of the 2024 season. So I can't stress enough how significant that was for Henley because he could have very easily been brushed aside by a new coaching staff, specifically this coaching staff who drafted their guy to bring with them to the NFL out of Michigan. But he was obviously too good to ignore for this coaching staff. And that LB1 role is now his. And hopefully Junior Coulson joins him as a full-time player or close to it this season. But looking at Henley's numbers, really encouraging for year one as a starter. He ranked 90th percentile in tackles versus expected, likely would have been much higher if not for the goose egg in week 17. I know people are still bitter about that, which, I don't know which one of you pissed off the fantasy gods for that to happen to us all on championship week, but please, no more deals with the devil in 2025 and beyond. But Henley graded as a top 20 linebacker in coverage, which was great. And he finished as the overall LB15 on the year as well. So a lot to like about Henley heading into 2025 and beyond this season, and really just don't have much concern about him being pushed out of that role, even if Coulson also emerges as a full-time starter, which I think should be the expectation at some point. There's reason to believe that both of these guys can coexist as IDP starters in Los Angeles. Okay, on to the top 10. And now I could get to that other linebacker who earned his contract this offseason. I think I referenced it with Ernest Jones. And we got new contract this offseason, put himself in this kind of top 10 conversation. And that's Damen Sherwood of the New York Jets, who I did not expect to be here last year, but credit where it's due. He played so good in 2024 that he made CJ Mosley expendable, and he took over a starting spot in the Jets lineup and never looked back. So even, getting this contract extension with the team is huge. That locks him up through the 2027 season, and he's just 25 years old. Like, I'm a fan of Sherwood. I have been since we covered him back on our rookie pod back in 2021. Now, it's definitely taken some time for him to get to a point where we can be excited about him in IDP, but based on what he accomplished in 2024, the wait has been worth it. He graded as a top 25 linebacker overall. He ranked 86th percentile at his position in tackles versus expected. He was a top 12 IDP linebacker on the year, and he got paid to be a starter in this defense for years to come. So that last part is huge, right? Like, because Sherwood he was expected to be a free agent this offseason, which would have left his usage and his role kind of up in the air depending on where he landed and what the contract was and how his new team potentially viewed him. But all of those concerns were squashed with the Jets giving him a 3-year deal worth $15 million per year. $15 million per year definitely gets you ranked inside the top 10 dynasty linebackers. So welcome to the club, Damen Sherwood. All right, one of the players who I think should be in for a significant bounce back is my LB9 here, and that is Foye Oluokun of the Jacksonville Jaguars. So Foye was going into the 2024 season as the back-to-back-to-back LB1 in IDP. So finishing the year as LB23 in points per game, missing 4 games is undoubtedly disappointing. So I think a lot of people are going to cool on Foye heading into 2025, but I'm here to tell you there's reason to be optimistic where he can bounce back. Maybe not to the point where he's going to be the overall LB1 again, but I think reestablishing himself as that top 12 linebacker for IDP is absolutely on the table here in 2025. And that's what keeps him in this top 10 for me, because previously he was so good for IDP that he used to be much higher than this, right? But keep in mind that last year, Ryan Nielsen was the defensive coordinator, and it was just a complete disaster in terms of deployment, where Foye started the year occasionally rotating off for some drives. Then he got hurt, missed games, and when he came back, his snap share, it did improve a bit, where he at least had 4 games playing 100% of snaps in the final 10 games of the season, but the usage shifted where he was being deployed off the edge for the first 4 games back from injury, but not even rushing the passer. It was really weird, and all of it killed his tackle efficiency on the season. So even with all that cracked usage, like, he actually delivered pretty much right on expected as a tackler based on that deployment being used in a completely new and unfamiliar way. So now entering 2025, Anthony Campanelli comes in as the defensive coordinator. He was previously with the Green Bay Packers as their linebacker coach. He should deploy a much more normal linebacker rotation where there's at least one full-time linebacker. And by all accounts, that is going to be Foye Oluokun and back in that more traditional middle linebacker deployment for Foye as the leader of that group, which should get him right back into that LB1 conversation for IDP if he's healthy. And for Dynasty too, like, he's locked up through the 2027 season, while guys like Devin Lloyd and Chad Muma are likely gone after this year. So Foye plus Jacksonville Kaiser are the near future of that Jaguars linebacker core for a couple seasons, it looks like. Okay, speaking of the future of linebacker cores and rookie linebackers in particular, there are a couple who I'm very optimistic about for Dynasty coming out of this 2025 NFL draft, starting with my LB8, Carson Schwessinger of the Cleveland Browns. Now, look, we're fresh off rookie season where we've talked a ton about this 2025 class. And if you want more of my detailed thoughts on Schwessinger and the rest of the 2025 linebackers, you can go back listen, watch the rookie linebacker episode with the legend Kyle Bellafuel that we recorded coming out of the 2025 NFL draft. And in that episode, and even more so in the pre-draft version of the linebacker episode, you'll hear me talk about my linebacker prospect model, which has been pretty successful at identifying top prospects at the position. And Schwessinger was one of the top names coming out of this year's class, earning a 7.94 prospect score, which ranks 89th percentile since 2018. Basically, that is to say that about 27% of linebackers with at least a 7.5 score go on to become top 12. So slightly better than 1 in 4. 42% go on to become top 24, and then 56% go on to be top 36. So about a 1 in 2 chance based on his college metrics alone that Schwessinger will be a starting IDP linebacker for us. And that's using the model as a guide more than anything, because the landing spot is also encouraging, as he should be the future of that Browns linebacker core. I think sooner rather than later, even if he takes some time in year 1 and he doesn't become a full-time player until year 2, there's a need there where he'll at least get on the field as a rookie and be able to show what he can do. And everything coming out of college in terms of coverage ability and his nose for the ball says that this could be a high-end IDP for us. Obviously, this is a projection, but as a very early round 2 pick, again, excellent draft capital for the position, there's plenty of reason to be optimistic about him and value him highly for IDP. And the same goes for my LB7, Jihad Campbell out of Alabama, and now of the Philadelphia Eagles, who scored even better than Schwessinger in the prospect model as a first-round pick. His 8.35 prospect score puts him at a slightly better than 1 in 3 chance to be a top 12 IDP linebacker, better than 50-50 shot at being top 24, and about 2 in 3 chance of being top 36. So when it comes to prospect projection for fantasy, especially at the linebacker position, that is about as good as it gets for success rates. And Campbell should be a fun one for us in IDP. Now, there was all this talk about the Eagles deploying Campbell as an edge with a little off-ball deployment. Then there was news of him, being more off-ball. So until he practices at OTAs, which we might not have a great idea of what to expect this season. And he hasn't practiced yet, unfortunately, much like Nakobe Dean. But either way, regardless of the expectation of how he'll be used as a rookie, getting first round capital is massive for Campbell's dynasty potential. And even just his chances to get on the field as a rookie, whether, he is an edge or an off ball linebacker, whatever the case, they're going to find ways to incorporate Campbell into the defense in 2025 and give him some opportunities to make an impact as a rookie and develop into the first round prospect that they drafted him to be. And if it doesn't work out for him in Philly, then someone else will take a shot on him and give him a significant role. I guarantee you that. Okay, on to a more known name and known commodity for IDP as my dynasty LB6. That's Sire Franklin of the Indianapolis Colts, who tied with Kaden Ellis as the LB2 in points per game last season, finishing as the LB3 overall. That marks 3 straight seasons as a top 5 IDP linebacker for Franklin. So elite consistency for Zaire is what puts him in this conversation, despite being 29 years old come week 1. He too is signed through the 2027 season, which again helps feed his long-term potential. Honestly, I don't know how much I have to say with Zaire. We all know who he is and what he's accomplished at this point. I mean, I pretty much just said it with, 3 seasons of top 5 IDP production. His status as a locked-in full-time player isn't likely to change, even with a new defensive coordinator, Lou Anarumo, coming in. There's no concerns there, especially considering that the next best option on the team right now is Jalen Carley. So this is still very much Sire Franklin's team, and given his history of production, we should once again feel comfortable investing in him highly at the position. And it's that high-end consistency that we're investing in. We know that what we're getting with Zaire. We shouldn't likely be blindsided by him losing his job or anything crazy this year, even though, Foye had that a little bit last year. It wasn't him losing his job. It was just a defensive coordinator getting too cute with the usage. And now he doesn't have that job anymore. So it's also just very rare for these kind of established linebackers. So I don't have those concerns with Sire Franklin right now heading into 2025. All right, we're on to the top 5 now. And if anyone told you that Zack Bond would be the Dynasty LB5 at this time last year, you would have thought they were insane. No question about it, because the amount that had to happen and go right for this to be the case was like a 1 in a million chance. And we live in the timeline where this came to fruition because Zack freaking Bond was our IDP LB1 last season, both overall and in points per game, and he led the position in tackles versus expected, and he was the number one graded linebacker on the year and the number one graded linebacker in coverage. And he was able to top that all off with a Super Bowl and a nice new contract. So that is probably the most complete breakout season we've ever seen from the linebacker position. And to be honest, a lot of positions really. But now that 2024 year was just way too good to ignore. There's pretty much no way he could possibly top what he did last year. So really he could only go down in 2025, but that's a very pessimistic way of looking at Bond because what we should be expecting is that he is able to deliver at a similar level, at least in terms of his overall production. Maybe not necessarily to be the number one graded linebacker and another Super Bowl and things like that, but the production being the biggest key. If he can continue to be a 100% snap player, which there's no reason to believe he won't be, and just rank in the top 80th to 85th percentile of tackles versus expected, like we should expect another top 12 linebacker numbers for him and for IDP in 2025 and then beyond as well. So he's 28 years old, but again, that's not a huge deal when you factor in literally everything else that Bond has going for him coming out of 2024. So he's in the top 5 dynasty linebackers for me right now. All right. Well, Zack Bond is on the older side. I do have some exciting youths within the top 5 as well, if you'd like to build your linebacker position that way. Starting with Edin Cooper of the Green Bay Packers, the best Packers linebacker, in my opinion, and one with a lot of room to grow as an NFL player and IDP producer because Cooper's role as a rookie was that of a part-time player, which even as a second round pick, that is expected and it's perfectly fine. We've talked about this already a few times, but it's not a knock on him as a player. It's just how NFL coaches often run their defenses. That being said, at the end of last season, week 17, 18, and then in the team's wildcard game, Cooper averaged 90%, 97% of the defensive snaps. Now, Quay Walker was out late in the regular season, but he was back for the lone playoff game, and Cooper remained in a true 100% full-time role. So there is a lot more momentum behind Cooper right now based on the end of last year than there was even heading into week 17, because as good as he was, and he was very good, he hadn't played more than 70% of snaps in a single week up until that point, mostly much lower than that. So it was all small sample stuff. And to an extent, it still is, but I think Cooper is just too good to keep off the field at this point. He earned a top 5 PFF grade overall, top 25 in run defense. He was top 20 in coverage, 84th percentile in tackles versus expected. So even though he was LB 48 in points per game, that is much more a product of him not getting a full-time role than anything else. He should get a full-time role in year 2. And if he continues to produce the way he did as a rookie, then Coop should be an absolute beast for IDP going forward, and wouldn't be surprised to have him even higher on this list with a great year 2. Speaking of exciting young linebackers who I have high expectations for, my Dynasty LB3 Detroit Lions 2023 first round pick, Jack Campbell. Now, it's been 2 years since the Lions selected Campbell in round 1, and all we've ever asked for is a full-time role to let this man cook. And it took about 75% through those 2 seasons, but we finally got it last year. The season, it didn't start out that way. It took until I think about week 7, I believe it was, for Campbell to be that full-time player at the same time that Alex Anzalone was in the lineup, but it did finally happen. And from week 12 on, and even into the playoffs, Campbell played every single defensive snap, and that includes games where Anzalone was in the lineup. So it would appear that the Prince of Asgard, Anzalone, is no longer a threat to Campbell's playing time, and the Lions are comfortable deploying Campbell as a full-time starter. And why wouldn't they be? Top 12 PFF grade overall, top 20 in run defense grade and in coverage, 95th percentile in tackles versus expected. Assuming there are no injury concerns, we are about to get the best Jack Campbell season of his career so far. And I would not rule him out being a top 12 IDP linebacker this season based on how productive he's been so far in his career. Him and Edin Cooper, for me, are really the two incumbents at the position who I think by this time next year, I'll probably have over my current Dynasty LB1 and LB2. But let's get into those top two now because these guys, I think, both have a claim to the Dynasty LB1 throne. But for now, I'll start with who I have as LB2, and that is San Francisco 49ers linebacker Fred Warner, now the highest paid linebacker in NFL history, signing a 3-year extension just a couple short weeks ago. Often named the best linebacker in the NFL by most sources. We talked about how, a dynasty linebacker's best attribute is often how much confidence we have in them to be starters for the foreseeable future. I don't think there's a player that we can have more confidence in at this point than Fred Warner, which is why he's probably deserving his LB1. Um, Basically, the only tiebreaker being that he hasn't been the efficient tackler that our LB1 has been. And I also have a lot of confidence in that player to be a starter for years to come still. But for Warner, he was LB9 overall last year in IDP, LB17 in points per game, top 3 graded linebacker overall and in coverage, top 15 in run defense. Like he's everything you or the NFL want in a linebacker, especially one that you'll be looking to count on for several more years. So shout out Fred for getting paid, very well deserved. And if we're looking to invest slash value him in Dynasty, we're going to have to pay as well. And that leads us to the Dynasty LB1, which for me is Roquan Smith of the Baltimore Ravens. Now, Roquan doesn't grade as well as Warner, but what he does do, arguably better than any other player at his position, is deliver elite tackle efficiency every single year. He is the only linebacker to rank in the top 97th percentile in tackles versus expected in each of the past 4 seasons. He was the IDP LB5 in points per game last year and LB7 overall. Every year, we invest highly in Roquan in drafts, and he has consistently returned that value, which is much easier said than done. He is still under contract with the Ravens through 2027. He's 28 years old, and honestly, even after this contract is up, I still feel pretty good that he'll get another one as a starter in the league, similar to like a Bobby Wagner, where he's just going to be a factor for IDP for several more years still. And considering the elite production every year, I have no concerns about him as my LB1 right now. And I think he'll still be in that top 5 to 10 dynasty linebacker conversation for a few more seasons as well, just because of how he's viewed around the league as a top linebacker and just how productive he continues to be. It's a level of elite consistency that is very hard to find. And Roquan has been the poster boy for elite consistency for quite some time now. All right, there you have it. My top 24 dynasty linebackers. If you're interested in the full list, there is the article on pff.com covering my top 300 dynasty IDPs, which gets updated on our rankings page as well. And this list today actually did include a lot of those updates, even since the latest article dropped after the NFL draft. So, yeah, thank you all for tuning in. And if you would be so kind to like and subscribe, I greatly appreciate that. And if you want to talk dynasty linebackers in the comments, let's do it. Feel free to drop your thoughts in there and I'll do my best to get back to you. But yeah, since we're still in the quiet time of the off season, we'll do another one of these next week covering my top 24 dynasty defensive backs, which should be fun. So be sure to tune into that as well. But until then, peace out.